A man stands in a stadium built for 50,000 people, and he is smiling while his own government picks his pocket. That is not a metaphor. That is Rome, and it happened for over 400 years, and almost nobody who lived through it ever realized what was being done to them. Here is the question that should unsettle you. How do you control a population of over 50 million people, scattered across 3 continents, speaking a dozen languages, with no phones, no television, no internet, and only a fraction of them able to read a circumflex euros, without a soldier standing over every single one of them? Rome did not have enough soldiers for that. At the empire's height, the entire Roman military numbered around 300,000 men. Spread across an empire that size, most provinces saw a soldier once a year, if that. So the real question is not how Rome conquered its enemies. Armies can do that. The real question is how Rome kept 50 million people compliant, grateful, and even joyful for 4 centuries, using almost no physical force at all. The answer is uncomfortable, because it still works today, in your own city, on your own screen. And most people watching this will recognize it in their own lives before this ends. It started with a poet's insult that became a diagnosis. In the early 2nd century, the Roman satirist Juvenal wrote that the Roman people, who once handed out military commands, legal authority, and everything else, now cared about only 2 things: bread and circuses. He meant it as a criticism of a citizenry that had traded its political power for full stomachs and entertainment. He was mocking his own society. He did not know he was describing one of the most effective systems of psychological control in human history. Because here is what Juvenal understood before modern behavioral science had language for it. A person who is fed and entertained rarely asks who is feeding them, or why. Rome's rulers discovered something that dictators and marketers would rediscover for the next 2,000 years: a circumflex euros. That comfort is a leash, not chains, not whips, comfort. The Roman state distributed free grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens in the city of Rome alone, a program called the Annona. On the surface, this looks like generosity. Underneath, it was something colder. A hungry population asks questions. A fed population says thank you. The emperor who filled your stomach was not being kind for kindness's sake, a circumflex euros. He was making himself impossible to resent. This is the first psychological mechanism at work, and it has a name in modern behavioral science: reciprocity bias. Human beings are wired to feel obligated toward whoever gives them something, even when that gift costs them their independence. You will see this again in a moment in a much darker form. But first, there is a second question that should be bothering you. If bread bought loyalty, what was the circus for? The circus was not entertainment, it was engineering. The Circus Maximus in Rome could hold up to 250,000 spectators at once, a circumflex euros, more people than most Roman cities held in total. The Colosseum, finished in 80 AD, held around 50,000 more. Emperors did not build these structures because they loved sport. They built them because a roaring crowd, screaming in unison at chariots or gladiators, is a crowd that has temporarily surrendered its individual judgment to a shared emotional current. Psychologists today call this deindividuation a circumflex euros, the loss of self-awareness and personal responsibility that happens inside a crowd. A man who might quietly question imperial taxation while alone in his home will scream himself hoarse for his emperor's chosen faction in the stands, feeling united, feeling powerful, feeling like he belongs to something larger than his own grievances. That feeling is not an accident, it is the entire design. And here is the detail almost nobody mentions when they talk about bread and circuses, a circumflex euros. The emperor was almost always present, or his image was. Emperors sat in a raised imperial box at the games, visible to the entire crowd, often deciding the fate of a defeated gladiator with a gesture. The crowd did not just watch entertainment. They watched their absolute ruler perform mercy or judgment in real time, live, in front of them, as though he held the power of life and death over other men for their approval. He did. And every time he raised his hand to spare or condemn a fighter, he was reminding 50,000 citizens simultaneously that he held that same power over every one of them. This is where the story stops being about circuses and starts being about something darker. How do you make 50 million people love the hand that could crush them? The answer lies in a psychological pattern that predates Rome and outlives it: acircumflex euros, the human tendency to conflate power with legitimacy. When a ruler consistently demonstrates overwhelming power, especially power exercised publicly and theatrically, human observers unconsciously begin to interpret that power as proof of the ruler's right to hold it. Psychologists call this the halo effect applied to authority. Strength gets mistaken for virtue. Rome's emperors understood this instinctively, centuries before anyone wrote it down. Triumphal processions through the city, with captured kings paraded in chains behind a general's chariot, were not just celebrations. They were public proof, delivered in spectacle form, that Rome's power was real, and by extension that Rome's rule was deserved. But spectacle alone could not have held an empire together for 400 years. Spectacle fades. Crowds go home. Something had to work on people even when they were alone in their own homes, far from any stadium. And this is where Rome's control system becomes something closer to a religion than a government: acircumflex euros. Because in many ways, it was designed to be indistinguishable from one. Roman emperors, beginning most clearly with Augustus, cultivated the idea that the emperor was not merely a political ruler, but a figure connected to the divine: acircumflex euros, protected by the gods, sometimes worshipped alongside them after death. His image placed in temples beside deities the population had prayed to their entire lives. This was not incidental religious decoration. It was a deliberate fusion of political obedience and spiritual devotion, so that questioning the emperor began to feel, on some unconscious level, like questioning the gods themselves. This tactic exploits one of the oldest vulnerabilities in human psychology: our discomfort with uncertainty in the face of forces we cannot control. Ancient people, like modern people, wanted explanations for suffering, death, famine, and fortune. Religion offered those explanations. By merging himself with that religious structure, the emperor did not need to convince anyone to obey him through argument. He simply became part of the framework people already used to make sense of their entire existence. You do not debate the sun. You do not vote on whether to fear a storm. And increasingly, across the empire, you did not question the emperor. Here is where the deepest layer of the system reveals itself, and it is the part almost no documentary about Rome ever properly explains. Control through bread solved hunger. Control through circuses solved boredom and channeled aggression. Control through divine status solved doubt. But Rome still needed something to bind its elites: acircumflex euros, the wealthy, the educated, the ambitious acircumflex euros, because a starving man dreams of bread, but an ambitious man dreams of power, and power cannot be bought with grain. The mechanism Rome used for this was the patron-client system, and it may be the most psychologically sophisticated piece of the entire structure. In Roman society, every person of lower status attached themselves to a person of higher status: acircumflex euros, a patron acircumflex euros who protected them, funded them, and represented their interests, in exchange for loyalty, votes, public support, and personal service. A client's own client system rippled downward, and every patron was, in turn, someone else's client, all the way up to the emperor himself, who stood as the ultimate patron of the entire Roman world. This created something extraordinary. A chain of personal obligation running from the poorest citizen in the furthest province to the emperor's own household, with no link in that chain able to rebel without severing their own support system. This is loyalty engineered through dependency, and modern psychology has a precise term for what it produces. Learned dependency, a psychological state in which a person's sense of security becomes so tied to an external provider that the idea of independence feels more threatening than the cost of continued obedience. Rome did not need to threaten its citizens with violence at every turn, because it had already made the alternative to obedience a circumflex euros. Isolation, powerlessness, loss of status a circumflex euros, feel worse than submission itself. And this is the moment the entire mystery from the beginning of this story finally resolves. Rome did not control 50 million people with fear. Fear is expensive, unstable, and breeds rebellion, as Rome itself would eventually learn when its later, more brutal emperors relied on terror instead of this earlier system, and saw their empire fracture faster because of it. What the early and middle empire built instead was a closed psychological loop. Feed the body so it does not rebel from hunger, entertain the mind so it does not rebel from boredom, fuse the ruler with the divine so it does not rebel from doubt, and bind the ambitious into networks of mutual obligation so no one can rebel without losing everything they have already built. Every piece reinforced the others. A citizen fed by the Annona, thrilled by the circus, reassured by the emperor's divine protection, and connected through a patron to opportunities for advancement, had almost no psychological foothold left from which to resist a circumflex euros. Not because he was weak, but because the system had been engineered deliberately, generation after generation, to make loyalty the path of least resistance. This is not a uniquely Roman story. It is a human one. The same reciprocity bias that made Roman citizens grateful for their grain dole is the same bias modern institutions exploit with free services that quietly extract something greater in return. The same individuation that dissolved the individual judgment of a Colosseum crowd is the same phenomenon psychologists study in modern mass rallies, online pylons, and stadium crowds today. The same halo effect that turned Roman military spectacle into perceived legitimacy is the same mechanism that makes people today mistake confidence for competence, wealth for wisdom, and power for truth. And the same learned dependency that bound Roman clients to their patrons is the same psychological trap that keeps people today in situations, relationships, and systems they know are unequal, because leaving feels more frightening than staying. Rome fell eventually, not because this system failed instantly, but because it slowly rotted from within a circumflex euros, as later emperors relied more on brute coercion and less on the psychological architecture their predecessors had built. The loyalty that spectacle and provision had once purchased began to erode, and by the time the empire faced real external pressure, it no longer had the deep, willing compliance that had sustained it for centuries. The chains had never been physical. And when the invisible bonds of bread, spectacle, divinity, and obligation finally weakened, there was nothing left holding the structure together. The secret was never violence. The secret was making obedience feel like the reasonable, comfortable, even joyful choice a circumflex euros, so complete that thanking the very hand that ruled you began to feel like gratitude, not submission. And the most unsettling part of this story is not what happened in Rome 2,000 years ago. It is recognizing how many of these same mechanisms are still quietly at work around you today, wearing different names, offering different rewards, but asking for exactly the same thing Rome asked for: your loyalty, given willingly, in exchange for never having to ask who benefits from it.